Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a PlayStation-themed gaming monitor from Sony. Sony has created a new brand called Inzone, which is releasing a number of different products for PC gamers that includes 2 gaming monitors and several gaming headsets. And this is the 27-inch 4K 144Hz refresh rate gaming monitor, the Inzone M9, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about my experiences with this monitor, the specs and features of it, what it's like to use, and the various things of highlight. And as you can see, the stand at the bottom looks like they've locked off a bit of a PlayStation 5 and stuck it in the middle, and there's actually an interesting logic as to why that's the case and the sort of layout and logic of this monitor. Now, these monitors are aimed at heavy shooters and FPS gamers, so people that are passionate about FPS and want the best results. This is a 4K display, but they're also releasing a full HD 240Hz monitor later on as well. And this monitor is interesting for a number of different reasons. Firstly, it packs in some pretty decent specs with 4K 144Hz. HDR 600 is DCI EP3 95% validated, and it has full array local dimming as well, with 96 local dimming zones, as well as a 1 millisecond grey to grey response time too. And as you can see from these shots from various different angles, it really looks the business too. It looks fantastic. It has really been quite a pleasing monitor to play on. I'm not usually a fan of 27-inch monitors. I feel like they're a bit too small, but this monitor does deliver the goods with some really smooth action, really fast response, and a really good overall look and feel. Now, it has some other things that are worth discussing as well, and I'm going to show them as we go through. But it also includes some speakers, although I'll show you at the end that they're not really worth much. They're 2-watt speakers. They don't really deliver much in terms of the sound, but the focus here is obviously on the visuals, with a really nice 4K screen and overall graphical performance and some curious design highlights, which I'm going to show you now as I go through the initial setup process and talk to you all about it. So this is the rear of the monitor, obviously, and you can see on the left-hand side of the display here that we have a little joystick that allows you to go through the menu system, and below that the power button. So a simple little way to navigate around the various menus, and there are a number of different settings in there that I'll show you later as well, and I want to talk about. What you also see is a number of different connections. It has multiple different USB-A connections and a USB-B connection as well. You'll also notice that you have 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, a DisplayPort 1.4, and you can also get DisplayPort through a USB-C connection that's in there. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is there's a Kvm switch built into the monitor. This switch allows you to connect up 2 different PCs to the same monitor and then plug in your mouse and keyboard and then be able to control both machines from one setup of peripherals and one monitor. So that gives you the flexibility if you're multi-computering. Let's say you're dual computers for streaming purposes and you want to be able to control all of those computers from one set of keyboard and mouse, then you can do that. Pretty interesting, I think. The other thing to note is that you'll need to use DisplayPort to make the most of this. So if you want the 144Hz refresh rate, make sure you go with DisplayPort, but you do have the option of HDMI as well. Now, one of the things that I thought was curious during the briefing was the design of this. So I had a briefing with Sony and they talked about the layout and design of the stand, which might seem like a curious thing to focus on, but I want to talk about it for a minute. So you'll notice that this chunky looking stand that you saw the front of a minute ago essentially looks like a sort of PlayStation theme, and obviously you can see some of the white and black accents that would be familiar to PlayStation enthusiasts. It's also worth noting that there are some PlayStation exclusive features that I'll talk about later on. But the thing that was curious about this is they've gone for quite a chunky stand that faces towards the front of the monitor, slap bang in the center. And actually the reason for that is the layout of how they expect you to use it and how they think people will use it. So it's quite curious because I thought initially that it would get in the way, and I want to show you why and what I mean later, so stick with me for that. But as you can see, you have some little holes for threading through your cables. So I'm running a DisplayPort cable through here and basically a little bit of cable tidying, and it ends up looking fairly neat by the end of it. Obviously, if you were running multiple HDMI and DisplayPort cables into this, then you might come unstuck. And all those USB connections as well. I think the gap here might be a bit small, although my DisplayPort cable is a little bit on the chunky side. But this is how you do it. You run it through the little plastic loop that's included in there and then into that. Now, it's worth noting, obviously, 1.4 DisplayPort cable to get the most out of it, or 2.1 HDMI, but you do need the DisplayPort to get the maximum refresh rate. Now, this is a G-Sync compatible monitor. It's designed for PC gamers to make the most out of it, so I'll talk about that later on and show you the settings for that as well. Now, a couple of other small complaints that I had getting out of the box is the power brick is absolutely enormous, which might seem like an oddity, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is the cable from that power brick to the monitor is fairly short. So I actually found running it to the ground and then into the mains power supply meant there wasn't much flexibility in the length of the cable. You might not suffer with this. The other thing that I thought was really strange, considering the amount of money this thing costs, because it's £999, which is a lot of money, and probably about the same in dollars, is that it doesn't come with any HDMI or DisplayPort cables. It also doesn't come with any USB cable, so you don't even get that USB pass-through cable, which is really strange. So the cable you're seeing plugged in, that DisplayPort cable, is mine, that I purchased separately. There are no cables included in the box. That's a weirdity. So now you can see the monitor standing on its stand, and you'll notice that front-facing bit that I was talking about and the way that sort of juts out beyond the edge of the monitor. You'll also notice that the way the cable sits sort of tilts back, and there's a little notch at the bottom of the screen where it slots into the stand, which is kind of strange. And then obviously it slides up and down as well and tilts back and forth a bit. That back and forth tilt is pretty interesting too, because the idea is basically to be able to tilt it back and sit really close to it if you want to. If you feel like you want to get right up close to your monitor and do some forehead gaming, then you can do that. Now, I've noticed that there isn't much flexibility in sort of some of the tilt angles in side to side, but obviously you do have a fair amount of adjustability in the up and down movement, but you will notice a little bit of a wobble. If you're moving it around, you can see there's quite a little bit of a wobble there. I think if you had an unstable desk, you might struggle with it. But the idea is to create quite a shallow desk stand so that you have more room on your desk, and that was one of the important points that they wanted to make when building this, is to give you plenty of room for your mouse and keyboard for your serious gaming peripherals. At the rear of the monitor, there's also some lighting. This is ambient lighting strip that you can see running across the top there. I didn't really feel this was bright enough to do any justice to anything exciting in the room, and it only really goes through a few different colors that you can change in the menu. This is kind of a gimmick that a lot of monitors seem to have on at the moment, and it really doesn't add anything. It doesn't have any ambient lighting, or it doesn't change in game or anything like that. However, once I plugged the monitor in and started going with it, I found I was pretty impressed immediately. You can see it's got some nice representation of color. It looks really rich. It's a really good looking monitor in a number of different ways, and obviously you can also tweak the settings to make sure you're running at the right spec. So this is a 4K monitor and it runs at 144 Hz, so it's worth going into the display settings and making sure everything's set up properly. You'll notice that it's set to standard dynamic range in here, but there are HDR settings because it does go up to HDR 600, and I'll show you some of the tweaks that I made and some of the gameplay later on with that. You can also set it up to 10-bit color in NVIDIA's control panel and get it looking nice as well. So looking good so far. We've got everything set up now and we're tweaking some of the settings. Also went in and changed some of the 3D settings in here because I wanted to put low latency mode on, which is something that wasn't running on this machine. I've done a video separately on the various different settings that you can apply to get the most out of your machine for FPS purposes, and it's worth doing with a 4K display because obviously you're going to need a powerful graphics card in order to drive it. In here you'll also notice that it is possible to run audio through here, as I said already, 2 2-watt speakers, so nothing that's going to blow your socks off, but should be enough for just some casual listening if you want to just watch a film or something like that and you aren't too bothered about having anything fancy. What I found is they're really tinny, and I'll show you later on, if you stick with me, what that sounds like. This is the onboard menu, and you'll see a number of different options in here when you go through. So you'll notice there's the input for DisplayPort, HDMI and USB-C DisplayPort as well, so you can push through that. You can also check the DisplayPort number and other things in there. There's also a mode for auto switching, which I actually found was ever so slightly problematic, especially when running along HDR mode, because the screen kept trying to switch sources even when there was just one plugged in. There are other things buried in the menu system as well. One of the things they're pushing, for example, is this on-screen crosshair. It's fairly common nowadays, but you do have that there. Another thing is there's a frame rate counter as well, so you can get a little counter to show your refresh rate and FPS is actually on the top left of the screen. You'll also see that you can change the response time and the black equalizer, and then there are a number of other settings, including local dimming. So I said local dimming zones, 96 local dimming zones. So the idea here is that you have massive areas on the screen that will light up nicely, and that ensures that you have some nice dark areas, and also it will light up effectively without sort of glows from the top and bottom of the screen. Here you can see the Kvm Switch options. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to test this because I didn't have the cables to be able to do it, but you can see that you can sync it up with what display cable you're using, and then obviously USB connections that you're using as well, so you do have the ability to mess around in the menu here. I think it's really odd oversight that they didn't include the USB cable, at least for the USB-B connection. Bit strange, and again lacking DisplayPort HDMI cables, so make sure you've got those before you purchase the monitor if you haven't already. Then you can see that you can change the lighting, so that lighting strip at the rear is set to white as standard, and you can go through a number of different colors. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on that because my experience was it wasn't very good. It didn't really light up much of a space, but I've seen these sorts of things on many monitors and they're always a bit rubbish, to be honest, so don't expect much from that department. And then there are other various options. You'll also note at the top that you can see what mode you're currently in. So you can see it's 144 Hz at the moment, and then game mode. There are various different picture preset modes, including Game 1, Game 2, Cinema, FPS, and Standard. Now, the FPS one is the main focus of these Inzone monitors. They are aimed at FPS gamers, which is why you're not seeing RTS and racing modes and other things. The main focus here is to go into FPS mode and give you really bright screen effects so you can really see your enemies and get the upper hand on them potentially. Now, it's worth talking quickly about exclusive features designed for PlayStation users. I'm a PC gamer, so I wasn't able to test out any of these, but if you plug a PlayStation 5 into this, then it will automatically recognize that it's running a PlayStation 5, and it has a couple of different modes designed specifically for that purpose. So there's an auto HDR tone mapping, which allows the PlayStation 5 and the monitor to communicate with one another and set the local dimming levels to match the specs of the monitor in use, whether you're using the full HD version of this monitor or the 4K one, because there's a slight difference in the HDR. The 1080p model only has HDR 400, 4K as HDR 600. You can change the settings for HDR manually, of course, but the auto-tuning makes it easier for you. So if you're running a PlayStation, you just want really easy life, then you can do that. This sort of technology comes from Sony's Bravia television, so you can be rest assured that it's going to be pretty solid. Obviously, having a monitor designed by Sony, you're going to get a good experience, and that actually was the experience that I had on PC. It's fantastic. They also have an auto-genre picture mode, where basically it switches between game and cinema, depending on what you're doing. So if you're playing games, it'll put it into that gaming mode, but then if you're watching Netflix, for example, it will switch into cinema mode, which has a bit more of an expressive picture, whereas the game mode focuses on lower input latency and things like that. So you can see there are quite a few different things, both for PC gamers and PlayStation gamers. If you happen to have both devices, PlayStation and PC, and you plug them both into this monitor, you're going to get a pretty good experience. Now, what you'll notice when I go through these various shots of different games is it handles lighting really well. I'm not sure it's going to do it justice on camera. Obviously, this is translating through a camera and then onto whatever device you're watching it on. But what I found was the dark scenes were really dark. It was really, really dark, and then the bright scenes are really bright. This is especially prominent in games which have the HDR turned on. So you'll see some shots, for example, of Forza Horizon 5 with HDR on, and also of Watch Dogs Legions as well. Not all the games on PC have that. I do often find that HDR tend to look a bit washed out and isn't that impressive, and it is a bit finicky on some games, but it ran pretty well on here, and I was pretty impressed by it. I tried out a variety of different games, obviously focusing on those FPS games because I wanted to see how it handled it. I actually got a really smooth experience out of it, and my FPS count was pretty decent as well. As you might have noticed, I'm actually running a couple of different machines, so I was testing it with a 3090 and with a 3060 Ti on two different builds as well. So I was actually able to experiment with a couple of different setups and test out what that's like and the overall experience from it. It was smooth on both of them. Obviously, the 3090 is superior, but what you can see is some really nice shots. It has some great viewing angles, so you can see from all sides basically. I was sitting off to the side a couple of times so I wasn't in the way of the camera, so you could get a good view of what it was like. And just the representation of what the game's like and the maximum sort of settings on it's fantastic. Really good color representation, really good results from it. It's an impressive 4K screen for sure. Then 27-inch might be a bit small, but it still delivers the goods in terms of the overall setup, which I thought was interesting. One of the things I do want to talk about, though, is the way this stand sticks out at the bottom, because I do think it is a bit daft, personally. Their logic isn't that sound, but I'll show you what I mean. So my thought initially when I saw this was, well, that's going to get in the way of my preamp. So if you're using something like a Stream Deck or a Go XLR Mini or any sort of device that sits in front of your keyboard usually, you're now going to have to rethink the logic of where that sits, because now it's going to be in the way of your keyboard and there's going to be smaller amount of space on your desk. Perhaps that might be a problem. That certainly would be a problem for me. I don't know about you. But their idea is that you're meant to actually sit like this. So you're meant to sit really close to the monitor and also to put your keyboard and mouse on either side of that area. So they want you to sit like an esports player, get your face right close to that monitor, I suppose, so you can make the most of the 27 inches, but feel like you're playing on a bigger screen, and also so that you have the room to maneuver your mouse around and also still have space for your keyboard as well. This is not how I would play games, but I'm not a pro player, so if you feel like you are, or you're really serious about your FPS games and you like to position your keyboard at a jaunty angle and have plenty of room for your mouse because of that, then you can do it. This top-down view also shows that the monitor itself is actually fairly chunky, quite a fat boy in comparison to some of the other monitors I've seen. Not necessarily an issue, and when you're playing, obviously you don't notice it. It's straight on. There's no curvature here. It's very much a flat screen. Looks kind of curved at the back, but it is a classic 27-inch flat screen panel, an IPS panel, which, as you can see, does a really good job of showing off the various different colors and highlights, and more importantly, the lights and the darks. And that was my experience, and as you can see across a variety of shots, it ends up looking really good. Now, with the HDR mode, I found that I had to go into Windows to turn the HDR on and turn it on in the games for it to switch. And one of the points that I want to make is also I found with HDR on, it would often try and switch sources. I've already mentioned this briefly, but basically the screen would go black every now and then as it tried to switch to DisplayPort, even though it was already on DisplayPort. I think this was actually an HDR problem. A slight oddity in the display and the way it's set up, but I didn't experience this when playing the other games. So you can see there's no issues with Battlefield, for example, and the other games I was playing either. So the overall result is a pretty happy one, because mostly I don't play with HDR. If you do, though, it is worth bearing that in mind that there may well be problems. Hopefully the result of your experience will be better than mine, like this terrible out of shot focus where the Godfathers iron up my terrible shooting and my awful gaming skills. But hopefully this video has been useful. Be sure to check out the description for the specs and the other information of use. And also stick around, for in a second I'm going to show you what the monitor sounds like just off speakers, so you can just hear the sound of the speakers and get an idea of what they're like. They are fairly tinny. If you made it this far, smash that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what you think. And also a big shout out to my YouTube members who support my channel on a monthly basis. Thanks very much for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.